Deep in the woods where the small river slid, snake-like in shade the Helmstadt mystic hid. Weird as a wizard over arts forbid, whereby he read what man ne'er read before, and saw the visions man shall see no more, till the great angels striding sea and shore shall bid all flesh await, on land or ships, the warning trump of the apocalypse, shattering the heavens before the dread eclipse. A quote from John Greenleaf Whittier's Pennsylvania Pilgrim, 1872. Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. I hope that everyone is doing well. I'm in the midst of packing to move. I'm recording on Sunday and we're moving on Thursday. So I am recording in the kitchen today rather than the living room, both because the living room is completely full of boxes and also because it's been about 45 degrees in the living room all weekend. So I apologize for any differences in sound. If the quality is not quite as good this week, that's why. But I'm excited to move both because I'll have a little bit more space to have more of an office area in the new apartment, and also because the new apartment has radiator heat, so it's gonna actually be warm in there versus my apartment where it's about 45 to 50 degrees in any room unless the electric radiator is on. So it's sitting next to me right now, but also it's very bad for people like me who have asthma, so you either get to choose whether you want to be warm or you want to breathe, and I chose to be warm, so really excited after this week to not have to make this choice anymore. It's a pretty classic New York issue, right? Because an apartment can't have everything, and this apartment and the last apartment I lived in did not really have much in the way of heating. But in speaking of people not having heating and living in somewhat rustic conditions, today's topic is a really weird one that I found kind of while doing research about something else a month or two ago. We're going to be looking at a group of hermits who were in basically a Doomsday cult in Pennsylvania hundreds of years ago. The group went by several names, including the Hermits of the Wissahickon. I'm so sorry to anyone from Pennsylvania because I'm sure I'm mispronouncing everything, including Wissahickon. I'm sure that's not how you say it. They were also known as the Society of the Woman in the Wilderness, the Hermits of the Ridge, or the Mystic Brotherhood. The Woman in the Wilderness was a character from the Book of Revelation, and I just love the image that that name evokes. It's very scary and mystic, and I don't know, it just made me think of this like powerful female goddess like peeking out of the woods or something. I don't know. It's a cool image, at least the one it evokes in my mind. The members of this cult lived in caves and other rustic buildings in Pennsylvania. One of the caves where the cult lived, called the Cave of Kelpius, still stands today in Philly on a hillside in Philly's Fairmount Park above the Wissahickon Creek near a hermit lane, which is of course named after this group of Doomsday mystics. The cave is not technically a cave. It's been described as a man-made structure about the size of a spring house. And a spring house was a building that was constructed on top of a spring. It was basically there to, keep things from falling in and contaminating the spring. So some people believe that this cave wasn't a mystic's cave at all. Some people think it was just a basic spring house. The structure once had a fireplace and a chimney, but they were both removed in the 1940s because of vandalism. And there's also a marker right outside the cave that the Rosicrucians put there. The Rosicrucians are an occult organization. They put a marker that said that the site was where Philly's first mystical guru came to meditate and await the second coming. Next time I go to Philly, I really want to check out this park and this cave. I've seen pictures of it. It looks awesome, but I have not been there yet. But that's what's left of this weird society of doomsday hermits. Let's go back to the 1600s and look at the story of who these people were and why they came to America to wait for the end of the world. So this is the story of a man named Johannes Kelpius, a mystic who led his group of educated men who were interested in the occult to Philly to wait for the end of the world. At the time, Philadelphia had recently been founded by a Quaker named William Penn in 1682, Pennsylvania colony in general had a reputation for being really tolerant when it came to religion, so it was the perfect place for a strange European man to bring his Doomsday cult. Johannes Kelpius was born in Transylvania, yes, really, that Transylvania, in 1667. His birth name was Johann Kelp, but back then, it was customary for academics to receive Latinized names, so after attending a university in Bavaria, he received his new name, Johannes Kelpius. When he was 22, he had earned a master's degree in theology, and he'd also published some writings. While at the university, he became interested in pietism, which is a Lutheran movement that emphasizes biblical doctrine as well as piety on an individual level. I had never heard of this because, if I'm being honest, when it comes to religion, I know a whole lot about Catholicism, a little bit about Judaism, and everything else is mostly a question mark. I guess I'm from Texas, so know a lot about Southern Baptists as well. But when it comes to Lutherans, I'm very ignorant, so if I get anything wrong, please let me know. So I had never heard of pietism, but I guess it was a big influence on Protestantism in North America and Europe. It emphasized frugality, restraint, and order, and I guess there's a sort of mysticism tied into it. Apparently, esoteric and heretical Christian ideas were often lumped into pietism. So it wasn't exactly vanilla Lutheranism. It was something a little bit different. So when he was 20, Kelpius had become a follower of Johann Jacob Zimmermann, a German nonconformist theologian, mathematician, astronomer, and former cleric who believed that the end of the world was upcoming. And he also had a lot of criticism of the state church, and both of those things cost him his religious position. Zimmermann's followers were all highly educated, and Zimmermann called them the Society of Perfectionism or Chapter of Perfection. Though nowadays, we tend to view the occult and religion as separate things, back then, people really saw them as connected. So Zimmermann's group was full of highly educated religious people who I've also seen referred to as interested in Kabbalah, Hermeticism, Rosicrucianism, and just general occult things. So, their occult studies and education were all a part of their standing as highly educated religious people. There was a great article that I found, an academic article, called German Kabbalists in Early Pennsylvania by Elizabeth W. Fisher that talks all about Kelpius and his comrades. It also has a good summary of what Rosicrucianism meant at the time. Apparently, 2 16th century authors wrote about Rosicrucianism a lot and popularized it, and one of those authors was a man named Johann Valentin Andrei. So I want to read a little bit from the article because I think it articulates it a lot better than I could summarize this. In the Fama, or Discovery of the Most Noble Order of the Rosy Cross, Andrei created a fictitious character, Christian Rosicrucian, who had lived for 106 years, from 1378 to 1484. The story held that Rosicrucian had been a great traveler, and in the course of his travels in the Arab countries and Spain, he learned the Magia and Kabbalah, a treasure surpassing that of kings and emperors. But Rosicrucian believed that the time was not yet right to reveal this knowledge, and so he appointed loyal and faithful heirs of his arts and also of his name, a Rosicrucian fraternity, to guard the knowledge for posterity. These brothers were all evangelical Christians and confessed to have the knowledge of Jesus Christ. This secret knowledge was powerful. It gave the Rosicrucian brothers the ability to read that great book of nature. This book was open to all, yet there are but few that can read and understand the same. Borrowing the fundamental premise of the Kabbalah, the Rosicrucians argued that God imprinted the same characters and letters that he had incorporated into the Holy Scripture into the wonderful creation of heaven and earth. Like astronomers and mathematicians who could predict eclipses, the Rosicrucians could foresee the darkness or obscurations of the church and how long they shall last. We have borrowed our magic writing and have found out and made a new language for ourselves, in the which withal is declared the nature of all things. Nature was the key to knowledge, for God had revealed divine meaning in the hieroglyphic characters he had written in the universe. Since his whole creation was harmonious, and the microcosm corresponded to the macrocosm, then men could attain knowledge of divine things through mathematical, magical systems. All right, you got all that? Maybe it's just because I've been packing all day and I'm exhausted, but I keep mispronouncing words like Rosicrucian and other things. So I'm trying to fix them as I hear myself mispronounce them, but please forgive me if I say some things very strangely. I'm very tired. Anyway, that was a little bit of information about Rosicrucianism. From his published works, it's clear that Kelpius was familiar with Rosicrucianism, and it seems likely that Zimmermann and Kelpius met at a Rosicrucian or Kabbalistic meeting. Zimmermann determined that revelation, or, the end of the world, was at hand, and that the place to be at the time of the end of the world was Philadelphia. Sure, why not? Philadelphia is well known as meaning the city of brotherly love, which is, I think, from Greek, I believe, but it also means something else. I had totally forgotten this because it's been a very long time since I last read Revelation, but if you take a look at your Bible and turn to Revelation 3, verses 7 through 13, there's a section about the church in Philadelphia, and I'm going to read a few verses from the New American Bible about Philadelphia. To the angel of the church of Philadelphia, write this: the Holy One, the true, who holds the key of David, who opens and no one shall close, who closes and no one shall open, says this: I know your works. Behold, I have left an open door before you, which no one can close. You have limited strength, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. Skipping ahead a bit. Because you have left my message of endurance, I will keep you safe in the time of trial that is going to come to the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. I am coming quickly. So, in reading that bit, you can kind of see how, if you're in a doomsday cult of religious people and you think the end of the world is coming, it does sound like maybe Philly is the place to be. So the group of Zimmermann's followers prepared to leave Europe and go to the American colonies. But during those preparations, Zimmermann died suddenly, and that left 27-year-old Kelpius as the leader of the group. Around 1694, the group of about 40 people arrived in Maryland and went on to Philadelphia, which at the time had about 500 houses in the whole entire city. It was a pretty small place, especially by our standards today, and you could definitely say that Philly was on the edge of the wilderness, which was another thing that made it great as a place to wait for the end of the world. So there were 40 people who came, and, the number 40 is significant. During the flood in the Bible, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights at Mount Sinai. Moses and company wandered the desert for 40 years. Jesus fasted in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. So on and so on. There are a lot of 40s in the Bible. So that's significant. So these 40 people, monks, let's say, moved to the Philly area. They built a large meeting house, which of course was 40 feet square. And some people say they lived in the meeting house, though it's also possible that maybe they were living in nearby caves or cabins. It's been said that they kept books and scientific equipment in the caves, though I've also read that the meeting house contained their books and equipment. And also I read that the meeting house contained an observatory to be used for astronomy. Some people even said that they had a telescope, but at any rate, it was the first observatory to be set up by colonizers in the New World. So these monks thought that the world would end, or they thought the events of the Book of Revelation would happen in 1694. I thought that the Wikipedia page about this put this really poetically. Though no sign of revelation accompanied the year 1694, the faithful, known as the hermits or mystics of the Wissahickon, continued to live in celibacy, searching the stars and hoping for the end. And while that sounds kind of grim and a little gloomy, it seems like they took the lack of the end of the world in stride. While they continued to wait for the end, they went ahead and built a school for kids in the neighborhood. They held worship services that were open to the public. And, since they were really well educated, they shared their medical knowledge, which was very valuable. They also opened a botanical garden and an orchard. They studied astronomy. They wrote poetry and music. And they also dabbled in alchemy, divination, and conjuring. Every year, they celebrated the anniversary of their arrival on June 23rd, which is St. John's Eve. I had never heard of St. John's Eve, but it's the day before the feast of John the Baptist, and because it nearly coincides with the summer solstice, it can be a pretty big celebration in some places. Traditionally, people would light bonfires and collect medicinal herbs. The monks would light a bonfire in the woods and then scatter the embers, and the idea was that this symbolized how the sunlight wanes between the summer and winter solstice. In 1701, after the St. John's Eve bonfire, the monks reported to have seen, quote, a white obscure moving body in the air, which, as it approached, assumed the form and mien of an angel. It receded into the shadows of the forest and appeared again immediately before them as the fairest of the lovely. You know, one man's angel is another person's ghost or fairy or alien, whatever. I think it's very cool that they found some kind of weird paranormal creature in the woods. I love that detail. So things seem to be going pretty well, aside from the end of the world thing not happening. So, the monks continued to do their occult studies and religious studies. Kelpius seemed to be searching for immortality, which is, a very alchemical pursuit. And he also believed that when he died, he would be transfigured like the prophet Elijah and brought into heaven in the flesh. So, near the end of his life, he spent 3 days praying for that. But when it became clear that his bodily ascension into heaven was not going to happen, he spoke to his friend Daniel Geisler, and he gave him a sealed box, and he asked him to throw it into the Schuylkill River. Geisler knew that Kelpius had been searching for immortality, and he thought that the box might contain something to help with that, so instead of throwing it into the river, he hid it on the riverbank. When Geisler returned, Kelpius looked at him and said, Daniel, thou hast not done as I bid thee, nor hast thou cast the casket into the river, but hast hidden it near the shore. Now convinced that Kelpius had mystical powers, Geisler went back and he threw the box into the river. He claims that when he did this, the box exploded, followed by thunder and lightning. Very cool. Of course, we have no idea if the story is true, but there's an article in the Philly Voice that points out similarities between this story and the King Arthur myth. When Arthur tells a knight to throw Excalibur, his magic sword, into the enchanted lake. Though the knight doesn't want to at first, eventually he throws it in, and the Lady of the Lake emerges to take it. Folks have pointed out that since Kelpius and his followers were highly educated, they would have definitely been familiar with the legends of King Arthur. So, there's some myth-making here. Then, Kelpius died of tuberculosis, or possibly pneumonia, in 1708, at the age of 35. His death was supposedly caused by exposure during the cold winter. As a mystic who probably worked to deny bodily pain, he likely didn't always make healthy decisions. So, unfortunately, that led to his death. When they lowered his coffin into the grave, they released a white dove. Classy move. We don't know where Kelpius was buried, and after his death, the community he had built began to decline. Many of the monks left, and it is said that about 6 monks continued to follow the lifestyle after the others left. People in the area would occasionally see them walking single file, wearing hoods and sandals, and it's been said that 6 ghostly figures are still seen on a nearby road called Forbidden Drive. So that's a fun little urban legend there. I wanted to read a story about one of Kelpius's remaining disciples. This was printed in the Southern Cross Review. Conrad Mathai possessed both healing powers and psychic ability. He cast horoscopes, exorcised demons, prophesied, and had the ability to project his astral body. In 1740, the wife of a ship captain consulted him. She inquired about her absent husband, who had left on a voyage to Africa more than 6 months previously. Mathai excused himself, then repaired to his bedroom for over an hour. The woman peeked in at one point and saw him lying on his bunk, pale and motionless as if he were dead. When Mathai emerged from his bedchamber, he told the lady that her husband sat in a London coffee house at that moment and would soon set sail for Pennsylvania. As predicted, the captain returned 3 months later. After hearing his wife's account, he decided to visit the fortune-telling hermit. Upon seeing Mathai, the captain declared that he had met him before in a London coffee house just prior to leaving for Philadelphia. The old man had given him a start by walking up to his table and saying, "You haven't written your wife. She's worried sick about you." I find that story really delightful and also very sweet. So it was kind of tricky finding a lot of information about these monks. Their story feels like it's been pretty forgotten, and the only things that really remain are, the cave in the park in Philly that I mentioned. And then there's also an oil painting by Christopher DeWitt, or maybe Christopher Witt, he's been called both names, an English doctor who painted Kelpius in 1705. Apparently, that painting is the oldest oil portrait in the United States. And DeWitt seemed like sort of a Renaissance man, so he had built a pipe organ for the group, who heavily featured music in their religious practice, and that was the first pipe organ in what would become the United States. In 1738, DeWitt apparently bestowed the first medical degree in Pennsylvania to one of his interns. DeWitt was the last surviving member of Kelpius's group, so to read a little bit more from that article in the Southern Cross Review, Witt's healing powers were so remarkable that some superstitious folk in Germantown called the doctor a Hexenmeister and crossed themselves after passing him on the street. Most of us know that Amish farmers put hex signs on barns to repel evil spirits. A Hexenmeister is a kind of warlock who can impose and lift curses. I assume this tradition and superstition is tied to the practice of folk medicine in Pennsylvania, which has a very long history and which is called powwow. So practitioners of powwow medicine in the past were seen as witches or warlocks. A botanist named John Bartram once wrote a nice little account of visiting DeWitt, which I wanted to read from. I have lately been to visit our friend Mr. Witt in Germantown, where I spent 4 or 5 hours very agreeably, sometimes in his garden where I viewed every kind of plant, I believe, that grew therein. We went into his study, which was furnished with books containing different kinds of learning, as philosophy, natural magic, divinity, nay, even mystic divinity, all of which were subjects of our discourse within doors, which agreeably gave way to botany every time we walked in the garden. I would have wished thee the enjoyment of so much diversion as to have heard our conversation. I love that little bit. It evokes such a nice afternoon, like just imagining visiting with this learned man with a beautiful garden. It really evokes a cozy scene to me. Of course, no historical figure is without their issues. So one bad thing we know about DeWitt is that when he was 70 years old, DeWitt purchased an enslaved man named Robert Claymore to help him with household chores. Claymore was very mechanically minded, so DeWitt taught him clockmaking, which was another of DeWitt's random skills. Why is it that back in the day, someone could know how to be like a doctor, a clockmaker, a botanist, an organ maker, a painter? I don't understand how there's enough hours in the day to learn all that stuff. But anyway, DeWitt taught him clockmaking, and people in the area, the ones who believed that DeWitt was a Hexenmeister, often claimed that Claymore was his familiar. After DeWitt died, again to read from the Southern Cross Review article, Robert Claymore received his freedom, a dwelling, small piece of land, furniture, clockmaking tools, and other household contents. That's something, at least, I guess. However, Claymore did not receive most of DeWitt's possessions after DeWitt's death, unfortunately. DeWitt left most of his land to a tailor, who had apparently showed kindness to the monks, and he also left 60 pounds to the hospital to treat indigent people, which, that's a good thing. I wanted to read a bit more about DeWitt's burial. So again, from that same article I've been reading from, mourners wrapped Dr. DeWitt's body in a linen sheet and put it in an unvarnished pine box. As the early February sun set, they interred him beside Daniel Geisler, Christian Warmer, and a few anonymous hermits of the Ridge in the community's graveyard on High Street between Bainton and Morton Streets, which measured 40 feet by 40 feet. Spectral blue flames were seen dancing around his grave for weeks. In 1859, the Episcopal Diocese of Philadelphia built St. Michael's Church on top of the burial plot, which locals then called Spook Hill. So that's cool. Blue flames dancing on a tombstone. This is such a weird story, and I love all the matter-of-fact paranormal things that just popped up around these monks. Because, of course, they were magic practitioners. But just something about the story, it feels like they're just so casually added in. Oh, yeah, and there were blue flames. There's ghosts of the priests or the monks walking around, etc. There are, of course, a lot of mysteries and loose ends, kind of like loose threads to the story, but there's one lingering mystery that I find very interesting. So there's a legendary stone that Kelpius was said to have, which may have been inside the box that was thrown into the river. So I wanted to read a bit of a headline from the DC Evening Star from 1909. Philadelphia girl owns stone of wisdom. Mystics and believers in the occult often have occasion to refer to the teachings of Father Kelpius, who prayed and taught and underwent visions which have puzzled the students of latter days. Inspiration of visions was a mysterious stone brought from India. Mystic Kelpius had found it on the floor of a cave inhabited by vicious serpents, broke the stone in 2 pieces and brought only half to the New World. Before his death he ordered his half thrown into the Wissahickon, and the half left in the Old World has now come to Miss Yetta Norworth of Pennsylvania. Man, headlines were long back then. So the article goes on to talk more about this stone. Through its powers, real or imaginary, he could read the future. He could conjure up wonderful dreams, visions much like those of Swedenborg. The stone enabled him to wield over his mystic followers an influence such as can hardly be understood today, an occult group around him. Along the stream in caves and in an abbey which has now been turned to highly modern uses of a golf club, the followers of Kelpius read and studied, dreamed and prayed. And ever their inspiration and guiding star was the sacred stone which the great leader had brought with him from India. The stone apparently had curious carvings bearing the message of the serpent, symbol of all wisdom. I wonder if that is the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. This story feels so linked to alchemy because, the snake recalls the Ouroboros, which was a huge alchemical symbol, and the stone really recalls the alchemical philosopher's stone. And it just, has this whole sense of mystic hermeticism because, of course, Kelpius and his followers were kind of in that zone. Apparently, a handful of Kelpius's followers really wanted to inherit the stone on his death, but to prevent that from happening, because Kelpius feared that people would use the stone for ill, he had it thrown into the river. However, the story goes that Kelpius had left half of the stone in Europe, so in 1909, that half was brought to America by one of Kelpius's distant descendants. The article said that she was a collateral descendant, which I assume means a descendant of a sibling or a cousin or something, because obviously Kelpius was celibate and did not have direct descendants. So this descendant, Yetta Norworth, became interested in the occult. Supposedly some of her relatives owned the stone at one time or another, but she's the only one who understood its message, and she said that she could tell the future using it. Her studies brought her repeatedly to the shores of the Wissahickon, where she meditated and studied and reflected like someone on a pilgrimage, and she said, "I have now progressed to the point where I too can conjure up visions, and I am convinced that these are genuine and not merely the imagination of a sensitive and impressionable woman. I can shut my eyes and produce a most wonderful picture of Kelpius in his cowl, teaching the lessons of gentleness and humility to the hermit monks that lived with him. There are religious ceremonies, the like of which I have never known in this modern world of ours, queer rituals, chanting hymns, odd prayers." So she goes on to talk about Kelpius, who, was very young when he took the stone from the cave of serpents in India, and apparently by the time he was 21, he started experiencing dreams and visions, which impressed occultists at the time, who began to follow him. He took his followers to the New World, and in fact one of William Penn's friends paid for their passage. She said that some followers lived in the meeting house, or abbey, as she called it, but Kelpius chose to live in the cave that remains in the park today, and he studied the stone in that cave. He gave specific instructions about the stone that he left in Europe, saying that it should pass down from the male head of the family and not be given to a woman in the family until there was a woman who understood what the markings meant. So as a child, Norworth began studying the stone, and soon enough she knew more about it than anyone else, and she was given the stone. And she said something that sounds really tied to Hermeticism and alchemy. So to read from the article some more, people of the West are apt to be unjustly prejudiced against the wisdom religion of the East, owing to the unpleasant things they are told about serpent worship in India and Greece. And while I may not speak fully, I may explain how the fate of the world is linked with that of the serpent in wisdom religion. The term serpent means wisdom and nothing else to the occult student. To the mystic, the serpent represents the perpetually renovated world, typified by the casting of his skin and return to a second youth every year. To me, the symbol is perfect. The mathematical figure of life is likewise complete in the symbol, where the serpent coils himself into a perfect circle with his tail in his mouth, having neither beginning nor end. This depicts eternity, or more properly speaking, immortality, of which all mystics are assured. She also said something interesting about how Kelpius knew that a women's era would be dawning, which is why he left the stone to her. Now, I've done some digging, and I can't figure out what happened to the stone, or to this woman, or to any of the other descendants of Kelpius. There's an organization online that is dedicated to kind of keeping some of these stories alive, but their website doesn't look like it's been updated very often. And I don't know, like the story of Kelpius and his followers kind of fizzles out after, this 1909 article. I would love to know more about it because it's such an odd story and it's so interesting. And I love the connection it has to American history. And it's just so weird that it's sort of faded away. But I guess America's had so many different religions and religious leaders that, this one didn't really lead to anything else. So I guess maybe that's why the story is sort of faded. There are, of course, still students of the occult in America, but I feel like most people who are really into occultism here, it's not like they're studying Kelpius. They're studying like the same sources that Kelpius was inspired by, I assume. But I love how this story combines occultism and alchemy with ghost stories and urban legends, and I don't know when I'm going to make it to Philly again. Last time I was in Philly was about a year ago, a couple weeks before the pandemic started, but I know once the pandemic ends, we're planning to go there again pretty soon. But I'm really excited to check out this park and this old cave and kind of see where all this happened. Because it's just an odd little story. So that's the story of Kelpius. There's one kind of weird little synchronicity that I did want to mention that, like most synchronicities, it's probably nothing. I feel like a lot of synchronicities are kind of like a wink, like the universe being like, I know what you're doing here. But I was packing today and I have like a small collection of stones that I've found different places and some crystals and stuff. And I had like a little bowl of crystals and stones. And so I was packing up the stones and crystals in this little bowl. And then I got to the bottom and the bottom layer of the stones was like super sticky and weird. And I don't understand why. So I figured, something must have spilled on these stones. I don't know what, but whatever. So I put this group of stones in a bowl in water, and this weird red greasy stuff rose to the surface. And so I poured that off and I was like, okay, like I'll let these soak a little bit more and then they should be clean. But all day I've been checking this bowl and there's more red greasy stuff. It's kind of gross, keeps rising to the surface of this bowl. It's almost like these rocks are like bleeding. Like, you can't squeeze blood from a stone, but I guess stones can bleed. And I don't really understand, like, I didn't think that any of the rocks in this little bowl are water soluble. None of them are sandstone or anything. I don't think I'm going to be able to get them clean, so I think I'm just going to throw them away because I can't have them getting everything sticky. But I thought it was so funny that today I was like soaking stones in water and being baffled by these crystals. And then tonight, when I was recording this episode, us talking about basically the philosopher's stone, being thrown into the river and passed down through history and having all this mystical significance. Meanwhile, I have these gross grease stones in my kitchen that are bleeding red oil all over everything. I don't know. It feels like one of those things, like, I don't know that there's any significance there, but it's just one of those bizarre things where you're just like, come on, man. Like, what are you trying to say here? And I feel like it's just the universe winking and being like, see, I know what you're doing. I know what you're up to. I don't know. I don't always understand how to interpret synchronicities. I don't think this has any significance beyond the universe winking at me, but I did think it was worth sharing. If anyone's curious, I can probably look up what these stones are. I think I still have the receipts from when I bought them, but none of them are resin or anything. Like, they're all real stones. I just can't remember now exactly what they are. But if you know things about rocks and have theories about them, please email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. I would be happy to tell you what kinds of stones they are, and you can tell me the story behind this. I don't know. I'm not knowledgeable enough about stones. But I hope you enjoyed this weird little story about these mystic monks in Pennsylvania, and the Philosopher's Stone maybe, and Cave of Serpents. And I hope that all of you guys have a great week. As always, you can follow the podcast on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review. Tell your friends about it. That will really help other people find the podcast. And you can find the show notes with all of the sources I used here at buriedsecretspodcast.com. And thanks so much for listening.